I'm in no sense part of the organisation of this excellent conference, but perhaps I can just explain that we're making a slightly late start to give everybody time to arrive. I think we'll wait a little bit longer, and I hope I'm not causing trouble by saying this, but if anybody would like a cup of coffee, there is one available just next door. So would you bear with us for another 5 or 10 minutes just to give everybody time to arrive, and then we'll get going. Thank you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, good morning once again, and welcome. I'm Stephen Hockman, and I have the privilege of being the chairman for this morning. Perhaps I could begin by echoing the remarks yesterday of my counterpart, as it were, who introduced the session yesterday morning, Professor John Harris, who quoted from the famous philosopher Bertrand Russell. And those of you who have read Russell's History of Western Philosophy will remember that it begins with a very striking sentence. The first chapter in the History of Western Philosophy is about the philosophy of ancient Greece. And Russell says that in all history, nothing was more surprising and more remarkable than the rise of civilization in ancient Greece. And that sentence has stayed with me ever since I read that book as an undergraduate. But I'm sorry to say that never until now, and thanks to the Eugenides Foundation, have I had the opportunity personally to come to visit Greece itself, and not only to discover how remarkable was the civilization of ancient Greece, but to discover how remarkable and how hospitable is the civilization of Greece today. So I want to say, if I may, on behalf of all your visitors, how marvelous it is to be here and how much we are enjoying our visit. I won't say that we would prefer to be outside in the sunshine seeing some of the sights. We've managed to do that one way or another, strikes permitting, in the course of the last few days. But it has been an absolutely memorable experience, and I'm sure we're all really pleased that we were able to be here. Now, I want to say one more thing about ancient Greek civilization, because yesterday, some of you remember that there was a little bit of problem with the timing. At times it looked as though one or two of the sessions might be overrunning a little bit. It wasn't in the end a problem at all, but there was a possible problem. And I discovered in one of my guidebooks that the ancient Greeks had a solution to this problem too. If you go to the forum, the Agora, which we visited earlier this week, where Socrates himself held court from time to time, you will find a very interesting new museum with a lot of interesting objects in it. And one of the objects, I forget the classical name, is a form of jug. And this jug was used in the law courts in ancient Greece in order to impose some sort of discipline on the lawyers. As a lawyer, I acknowledge the importance of these things. And what you do with this jug is you turn it over, and the liquid gradually seeps out. And it takes exactly 6 minutes, or however long it is, for the liquid to disappear from the jug. And when it's empty, in classical times, the lawyer had to stop speaking. Even if he was in the middle of a sentence, he had to stop speaking. So in classical times, there were techniques for imposing time limits on speakers. I don't think we're going to need anything quite so rigorous today, because in the first place, our speakers are going to be very self-disciplined, so no control by the chair will be necessary. And secondly, we have plenty of time. We have the course of the morning to engage in the topic which has been set for us, which, let's face it, is broad enough, the topic of environmental justice. I'm going to make one point, if I may, before using my privileged position as chair. I'm going to say something about one issue before I sit down, and then it will be my privilege to introduce our two keynote speakers. The first, Professor Linda Nielsen, Professor of Law at the University of Copenhagen in Denmark, and the second, Professor George Christie, Professor of Law at the School of Law at Duke University in the United States, or should that be Duke University, if one is a follower of American cinema, perhaps? Is that the way to pronounce it? Duke or Duke?
That's a good question. They call themselves Dukies, but I think Duke would be...
Duke University in the United States. Very good. So we're all very much looking forward to hearing from them in a few minutes' time. Let me just, most briefly, and remembering that classical Greek imposition on the length of lawyers' speeches, let me very briefly pick up a theme from yesterday and try and introduce the discussion that we're going to have today. Yesterday we were lucky enough to hear from a range of different individuals, and I think the cross-disciplinary nature of this meeting is one of the most exciting features of it. We were lucky enough to hear from a range of individuals on policy issues, dealing really with some of the biggest issues facing the world today: environmental issues, regulatory issues, scientific issues, medical issues, explaining what it is that we need to do and what it is that we need not to do if the really serious global issues facing us are to be resolved or progressed in some way. Many of us must have learned a great deal from that. But what perhaps was missing from yesterday's discussion was a really serious attempt to answer the question, how are we to put in place these policy ideas? Suppose that we need better environmental regulation. How is that to be achieved? And what I very much hope myself is that in the course of the day, with the help of the distinguished, predominantly, I think, legal figures who we will have on the platform, the two here now and later some equally distinguished panelists, I hope we will begin to provide an answer. How are these problems to be addressed? And let me offer at least a clue as to what in part the answer may be, because it certainly seems to me that the solution must lie in part in what might be described in very general terms as institutional reform. That unless and until we reform the institutions that we have in the world for addressing some of these problems, and maybe create new institutions, it's going to be very difficult to solve these problems. Global governance surely involves not just exhorting people to behave better, important though that is, and encouraging people to do so. It surely involves offering ways in which people can combine together, in which people can entrust to an institution the ability to make the changes which are necessary. That is surely the essence of what democratic government means. It means the multitude, the polis, entrusting to a smaller number of people the ability to bring about measures and changes which are necessary. And surely that ought to be all the easier today when communications are so much easier, when we have all the facilities of modern technology and communications. It ought to be infinitely easier to create that kind of new institutional regime than it was in the past. I admit that it doesn't seem particularly easy as we confront the problems which were so graphically described by our speakers yesterday. So institutional change seems to me to be at least one of the issues that we need to address, and that is why, and I mentioned this very briefly towards the end of the afternoon, some of us are interested in the idea of a new international environmental court. Time doesn't allow me to expand on that suggestion now, but it's certainly something that I feel would be of great benefit. And just to conclude these brief opening remarks by a topical reference, some of you will know that in 2012, the United Nations is planning to reconvene in Rio de Janeiro, the Earth Summit, which took place in 1992. So Rio plus 20, this is called by some people, and it will be a very major international meeting in Rio in that year. And the whole question of global governance on the environmental plane will undoubtedly be in issue in Rio in 2012. Planning discussions for that meeting are already starting. Once you get into those discussions, you discover that the systems we have at the moment under the auspices of the UN for global governance of the environment are already immensely complex. There are various organizations, the United Nations Environmental Programme among others, and insiders, I think, get extremely involved in the detail of this, and it is very complex, and there are many, many interests that need to be taken into account, and many views that need to be respected. But what I certainly hope is that standing back from the detail, which is important, that people will start to think about the need for a world environment organization of some kind, which in Europe is an idea that is gaining traction, and linked to that, and as a natural partner of a world environment organization, the notion of some form of arbitral tribunal, not necessarily limiting itself to disputes between states, which of course would be the remit of the International Court of Justice, but allowing complaints to be made by non-state actors as well, and something which I think may be regarded as rather unorthodox by classical international lawyers, beginning to break down the conceptual barrier between international law, the law governing relations between states on the one hand, and domestic or municipal law, the law governing the relationship between a state and its citizens. These are all, I think, extremely potentially fascinating issues, and issues which very much come under the overall heading of deciding how, in practice, a world containing a multitude of democracies can take advantage of the new technologies, not to abolish governance, but to make governance actually more powerful and more sophisticated, while of course totally respecting individual liberty and human rights. That's all I'm going to say, because you haven't really come here to listen to me. I'm going to have the great privilege and pleasure now of introducing what I think I may call the first, but only the first, of our distinguished speakers from Denmark, Professor Linda Nielsen, Professor of Law at the University of Copenhagen. Thank you very much.